Chapter 12, Tea at 4. The unsigned letter was reprinted in a number of major newspapers around the world. This was a first. An art scholar had become a thief and was asking the public for help. Overnight, Miss Yusi's classroom became a combination of museum and laboratory. The walls were soon plastered with reproductions of Vermeer paintings, and library books were piled on every surface. The kids borrowed powerful magnifying glasses from the science department, trying to see how the floor tiles Vermeer painted in the 1660s compared with those in the 1670s, or whether a hand in one painting was similar to a hand in another. They studied wrinkles, reflections, shadows, wood, glass, and fabric. In the process, they discovered how blurry most reproductions can become when examined through a magnifying glass. Miss Yusi seemed happy with the noise and argument and made everyone defend their opinions. Calder's job was to organize the data the class collected into a giant chart. Petra's was to record some of the conclusions about which paintings were real and which were not. Other kids set up a voting system and tallied the results or worked on letters that they would post on the internet. Talk that felt exhilarating in Miss Yusi's classroom was nerve-wracking elsewhere. Behind closed doors, those in museums or in positions of authority in the art world were deep and complicated, sometimes angry discussions. Everyone agreed that the most important issue was how to get back a lady writing. Her safety came first. They also agreed that a scholarly terrorist should not be allowed to blackmail the art establishment and endanger one of the world's greatest treasures simply to have his or her way. How could museums consider the thief's demands? Another problem was that the letter had fired the public's curiosity and imagination. The press had, of course, fed the flames. Suddenly, everyone from sports stars to taxi drivers felt entitled to share their thoughts on which work was a real Vermeer painting and which wasn't. There were interviews every day on the news. People talked confidently about Vermeer. In fancy restaurants, in subways, in donut shops, in elevators. There was a wave of rebellious feeling against those who were experts in the field. After all, if art wasn't for the people of the world, who was it for? And as the thief had pointed out, wasn't one set of eyes as good as any other? What did an education and a fancy degree have to do with seeing? The letters that swept over the internet were adding up in the thousands. Many were siding with the opinions of the thief. Some even forgave him or her in the interest of truth, feeling that the thief had a very important mission that would have pleased Vermeer himself. On the day her class voted on the attribution of each of the 35 paintings, Miss Yusi was oddly quiet. The majority of sixth graders sided with the thief, concluding that Vermeer's early and late works were indeed suspicious. Impatient to know what Miss Yusi thought, Calder asked his teacher for the question she usually asked them. "Well, do you agree?" He thought she'd be pleased. "We'll see," Miss Yusi said in a flat, grown-up tone. It wasn't like her at all. As she turned away, Calder thought she looked frightened. Several long weeks had gone by since Mrs. Sharp had invited Calder and Petra to tea. In that time, a lady writing had vanished. She was gone, but she was everywhere. She was still Petra and Calder's secret, but she was now a familiar face to many thousands of others. Mrs. Sharp had left a message for Calder at Powell's. He and his friend were expected for tea on Monday, November 22nd. As they walked slowly toward the house, the kids agreed that Mrs. Sharp was a good person to be seeing. If she liked both Fort and Vermeer, she might have some insights on the theft. Calder noticed the top of Mrs. Sharp's head, just the crescent of a tidy white bun, in one window. It was getting dark outside, and the lighted interior looked like a painting. Through the wobble of old glass, they could see the edge of the geographer over the sofa, a fan of rosy light on the ceiling, a lace curtain, and then abruptly, as if in response to their curiosity, a hand reached up and released the blinds. "Calder, something's funny here." "What do you mean?" Before Petra could answer, Mrs. Sharp opened the door. "So, you're the young woman who has my book. Hurry up, you're letting in the cold air. We're having tea in the kitchen. I hate any kind of mess, so that is where we will eat." Mrs. Sharp, ignored Petra's murmured comments about how nice the house was, saying only, "Watch your step and don't touch anything." Calder was thinking to himself that Mrs. Sharp was rude. For someone who was so proper, it seemed odd. She had barely said hello. The kitchen walls were decorated with Delft tile, and the plates in the glass cabinets were also blue and white. An old wooden table filled the middle of the room. Its surface, worn with age, glowed a buttery yellow. The chairs were large and heavy and had lions' heads carved on the tops of their backs. On the table sat a tray with a teapot, cups, and saucers, and a plate with tiny chocolate cakes. They were embroidered napkins. In the center of the table, in an earthenware jug, was a bunch of red tulips. Here's Mrs. Sharp and them in her kitchen. As always, pay attention to any clues. Why, it's Vermeer's world! Petra was touching the tile on the counter, running her fingers over the cobalt glaze with obvious delight. Sit down, both of you. You're not here to admire things. Mrs. Sharp's voice was true to her name. Perhaps realizing how harsh she sounded, she went off in a softer tone. We're here to talk about Charles Fort. This young man tells me you picked up my copy of Lowe at Powell's, but don't say anything until you've finished eating. Calder and Petra sat down and sipped obediently on tea served in cups so thin that you could see the shadow of your finger on the other side of the china. Calder's swallowing made a loud noise in the silence. Petra wanted to giggle, but instead choked on her cake and had to wash it down with a scalding gulp of Earl Grey. So, Charles Fort, what do you two make of him? Petra cleared her throat. He believes in figuring out the truth no matter what anyone else says. Calder and I like that. I mean, he's such a fearless thinker. Yes? Mrs. Sharp was looking at Petra with an intensity that wasn't at all comfortable. Petra looked over at Calder for help. Calder and I have been pretty inspired by his way of seeing. It seems like most people aren't brave enough to question things the way Fort did. Yes, his ideas have meant a great deal to me. Mrs. Sharp looked coldly at her teacup as if it had spoken instead of her. It occurred to Petra that maybe the old woman had said more than she'd meant to, that before Petra could think up an appropriate response, Calder blurted, "Then why did you get rid of your book?" As soon as he'd spoken, he knew he'd made a mistake. Trying to chat with Mrs. Sharp was not easy. It was kind of like playing with a dangerous animal. I was finished with it. Mrs. Sharp's tone made it clear that she could soon be finished with Calder, too. There was another silence. It has a dreadful stain on it, if you haven't noticed. All of Fort's books have just been beautifully reprinted in one volume, so I now have that. Calder remained judiciously silent. Petra stirred more sugar into her tea. You must like Vermeer. Horrible news about the theft, isn't it? Mrs. Sharp's face was mask-like. Charles Fort would have been pleased. Petra looked shocked. Why? Calder thought he understood. You mean pleased about all the questions, right? Mrs. Sharp made a noise kind of like a snarl. Calder, aware that he had trespassed again, looked down at the table. He was moving too fast. What was wrong with him? Petra tried to make things better. Pleased about how people are thinking for themselves? Calder pulled a pentomino out of his pocket and began tapping it nervously against his knee. For a long minute, everything was silent. I think the thief is very intelligent, Mrs. Sharp said. Both Calder and Petra looked at her. Calder couldn't restrain himself. Sure, he's smart, but so what? Does that make the theft okay? There was a long silence, and Calder could feel Mrs. Sharp's eyes drilling into his head. I think, as Charles Fort does, that people don't look carefully enough at what is around them. Mrs. Sharp stood up, signaling that tea was over. As they followed the old woman silently through the house, Petra and Calder absorbed as much of what was around them as they could. A pewter pitcher, several tapestries, goblets made of green and bubbly glass. "We must talk soon. I'll leave word with Mr. Watch." The door was shut before Calder and Petra could reply. They stood outside in the twilight looking at each other. Calder was still holding what he now realized was the F pentomino. "For someone who obviously loves Vermeer, she didn't seem too upset," Petra said. Calder frowned. "You know what my pentomino just said? Fooled. If she wasn't so old, I'd wonder if she had something to do with the painting disappearing." "What reason would she have for stealing it?" Petra asked. "Plus, can you imagine her hiring a bunch of criminals to do the dirty work? But what she said about people not seeing what was right in front of them, that did feel almost like a hint." They walked several steps in silence. Calder was scratching his chin with the F pentomino. "You think that it's Mrs. Sharp who's fooled, or us?" Calder got another letter from Tommy that evening. Something else had gone wrong, something besides Frog's disappearance. Here's another coded message. If you need to pause the video to write this down and figure it out, then you should do that. Calder felt partly responsible. It had been his idea that Tommy do some detective work, and now his buddy had gotten in hot water because of it. Suddenly, Calder felt guilty that he and Petra were sharing secrets while Tommy was on his own. He'd always told Tommy everything. It wasn't that he'd meant to leave Tommy out, it was just that so much had happened without him. He decided to call his old friend. There wasn't the same privacy on the phone as in their letters, but at least they could make a few jokes. Calder got a recording saying that Tommy's number had been disconnected. A shiver of fear ran down his spine. He dialed Petra's number and told her the news. "I can't help remembering Fort's stories about people who vanished into thin air, sometimes from the same area. You don't think this could be anything like that, do you?" Petra's voice was subdued. "No, but guess what? My dad just left on a business trip and wouldn't tell my mom where he was going. He wasn't mad or anything, but said he couldn't tell her right away. He hasn't been acting like himself at all lately. He kind of disappeared too." Both were silent for a moment. Calder was the first to speak. "Got the Vermeer notebook?" "Of course." "Can you add something about our tea with Mrs. Sharp? And maybe even Tommy's letter and the disconnected phone and your dad's mysterious trip? You know the way writing things down sometimes makes stuff clearer." "Good idea. Come over, okay?" Before Calder got there, Petra looked at their last entry in the notebook. It said, "Unknown. Do objects and people repeat because Vermeer painted at home?" Then she remembered. They'd been wondering if the woman who kept turning up in Vermeer's paintings were his family, surrounded by the everyday stuff of their lives. Absent-mindedly, Petra underlined objects and people repeat. People repeat. Who was the woman in A Lady Writing? Suddenly, it all felt so sad. Not only the theft, but the thought that the woman didn't have a name. Unknown. She was hidden somewhere in the dark, in danger and alone. Petra shut her eyes. As the first tear rolled down her cheek, she could suddenly picture the woman looking at her. Her earrings shimmering in that clear light. "Don't worry," she seemed to be saying. "I remember you, and I'm right here." Petra opened her eyes and sat up straight. She blew her nose. "But where are you?" she asked silently, feeling excited but kind of silly. Imagining a safe place to hide a small painting, she thought of drawers, cupboards, cabinets, closets, blanket chests. Everything she pictured was wood. And then Petra felt an odd certainty. It was dark wood they were looking for. By the time Calder turned up, she was writing madly in the notebook. "Calder, I think we just might have a clue." She explained that the lady had kind of helped her think of it. She wanted Calder to understand that. Calder shrugged. "It's a logical idea, you know. Dark wood equals fancy places. The thief is an educated person, maybe with a lot of money. He or she could easily live in a mansion with old cabinets or something. Good thinking. Petra wrote, look for wooden storage places in Chicago. Of course, there was Mrs. Sharp's house, but neither remembered seeing anything that might fit that description in the living room or kitchen. Maybe we can get a look at more of her house when we go back. I'll make an excuse about using the bathroom and run upstairs, Calder suggested. Or maybe she'll want something from Powell's before then. They laughed nervously about how furious Mrs. Sharp would be if she caught them spying. We'd be the next to vanish. You can count on it, Calder added. Both felt better by the time they had a blue one and closed the notebook. There was comfort in making plans.